As we discussed last week, North Carolina had the chance to prove they were elite on Saturday night by pummeling an inferior opponent. And yeah, that didn't happen.
You are Locked On Tar Heels, your daily podcast on the UNC Tar Heels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, it's Monday, October 23rd, 2023. Welcome into the Locked On Tar Heels podcast, the only daily North Carolina show out there. I'm your host, Isaac Shade, and I want to thank you for making us your first listen or watch to get your team every day. You everydayers, welcome in. So glad you're here, even on a sad day. If you're new to the show, if you're coming for the commiseration, we're glad that you're here too. Come join us on a more regular basis. This episode of Locked On Tar Heels is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. We will have takeaways from Carolina's secret scrimmage on tomorrow's show, Tuesday, so don't worry, we're not missing out on that, but we got to recap all the football stuff today, get back looking at that. But a reminder, this Friday night is Carolina's exhibition game against St. Aug's. Hard to believe that's already here. And 2 weeks from today is Carolina's regular season first game of the basketball season. I think probably coming into all the more happiness that it's that close, especially after what happened Saturday night on the football field. Speaking of which, new football rankings came out on Sunday. Carolina is 17th now in both polls. As always, on today's show, following a football game, we're going to have the game recap, our what to watch for recap, 3 stars of the game, and our shady stat of the game. And let's start there, just unpacking the biggest takeaway from the game. Basically, we need a group therapy session today. This is what we often do after losses is we all come together. I'm going to be Dr. Shade, and we just need that time together to like, life is terrible right now, but it will continue on. And so if you're new to the show since last year, either football or basketball season, that's what we do after losses, group therapy. So on Friday's show, I talked about in the open how we need to, or that we would learn more about the Tar Heels this weekend against Virginia than we really did against Miami. And here's why. We already knew that Carolina was talented enough to play with Miami. It's just who wins that game. The question then becomes, how do you follow that up? Can you then come down to play Virginia and not come down to their level? Can you just annihilate them and Drake may not even play the fourth quarter level? And the answer to that was no. Unfortunately, we did learn a lot about the Tar Heels, and we learned that we just can't have nice things. We learned that as Tar Heels, we're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, and drop it did on Saturday. And so we've learned that Carolina is not elite, at least yet, right? The talent and the depth are growing into that, but it's just not fully there. And I think where I'm at with this loss, I hope this doesn't feel like overstating it, but given all the context of what's going on, this to me is one of the worst and most embarrassing losses in recent Carolina football history. Here's why I say that. You think about, you've got Drake Maye, whom is widely regarded as the best quarterback in North Carolina history. You're 6-0. You're 10th in the nation. You have this shot at a very, very special season. You just got to take care of these 3-in-a-row teams that don't project to be all that great in Virginia, Georgia Tech, and Campbell before you really set up the end of the season stuff you want to do against Duke, Clemson, and NC State before postseason action. And Virginia was 1-5 coming into this game. They had never beaten a top 10 team on the road. But now Virginia is 2-5, and they have beaten a top 10 team on the road. So all of that combined, given the stakes of what were at play, in a game where you're a 23.5-point favorite, that's a brutal, brutal loss. And I had warned all week that the Miami game was not the letdown that you – I mean, obviously it wasn't a letdown, they won, but that's not where you were worried about a letdown. This is the game where you were worried about a letdown. What would happen after the Miami victory? And unfortunately, and I hate to say I was right, but I was. And it just keeps happening. Dadgum Box Scores put up on Twitter, this was the 6th time since 2020 that UNC has lost a game in which they were double-digit favorites. 6 times in 4 seasons, 3.5 seasons really, where they were double-digit favorites and just lost straight out. In fact, 2 of those 6 losses now have been when they were 20 or more point favorites. Here's the problem. It's the last 2 games. Saturday against Virginia and the other one, Georgia Tech last year. And that's your opponent this week. You got to make up for it in a big way. Well, to me, as I look at it, there were some player issues and there were some coach issues. The player issues, let's just highlight a couple of them. Y'all, something was off with Drake. Drake Maye was not Drake Maye on Saturday. He was missing targets. He was overthrowing behind receivers pretty regularly. And I know he's not a robot. But it's like to the point where I was wondering, like, is something physically wrong with Drake? Is he injured? Because this is not Drake Maye. Was something mentally off? Was something mechanically off? And to Drake's credit, obviously he owned it in his press conference, saying, I got to do better. Even when pushed on the wide receiver drops, which we'll get to in a second. He said, like, that's on me. I got to put the ball in a better position for those guys. And so, man, that was odd as well. And then that's the next thing. Player issues. There were so many drops, and you hate it, but the majority of them were Nate McCollum, just uncharacteristically doing that. JJ Jones had one where right at the goal line, he either would have scored 6 or been down at like the 1 or 2. So those drops certainly hurt. They're punting, and you hate it because it's a backup in his 2nd game ever, but it was just bad. And then finally, Carolina gets a good punt off late in the game. I forget specifically when it was. I do remember it was ultimately the drive where Virginia fumbled out the back of the end zone, but Carolina gets a pretty good punt, and then Tayon Holloway runs into it was like kick catch interference, 15 yards, great field position for Virginia. Bad player issues. Now, it wasn't just player issues. It wasn't just the players that came out flat that ate the so-called proverbial poison cheese that Mac Brown talked about last week. There were some coaching decisions that, I have to second guess. Like, that's my job. So while, yes, the team was flat, there's blame to be bestowed upon the coaching staff as well. For example, Mac going for it on 4th and 6 at midfield in the first half made 0 sense to me. And to be fair, he owned it and said, I don't know why I did that. I shouldn't have. And he's right. He shouldn't have. Like, in a game where you're already struggling with field position, Carolina started inside their own 10 3 times in the first half. In a game where that's happening, you got to play a little bit more field position. I get it. If it's 4th and 1 or 2 at midfield, knock yourself out. But 4th and 6, not a great decision. But the big one, the big coaching issue to me that we got to call out is the Omarion Hampton lack of enough carries. Everything was set up for him to have a massive, massive game against Virginia, but Carolina just didn't utilize him in the second half. As a reminder, last week, he rushes for 197 yards by himself against Miami, who prior to that hadn't allowed an entire team to get 100 rushing yards all season. And then that's coming into a game Saturday against Virginia, who had allowed 100 or more rushing yards to every team they had played this season. Now, let's be fair. Omarion did have a good and solid ground game, 19 rushes for 112 yards. He did great. Love it. But only 5 of those carries came in the second half. Those 5 carries yielded 36 yards, which plays out to 7.2 yards per carry. His game average was 5.9. So as per usual, Omarion's getting stronger as the game goes on, as he wears down the defensive front and nobody wants to tackle him. That's when he's most productive. That's when he's delivering his most punishing blows. And Carolina's not going to him. He should, in a game where he had 19 attempts, he should have had around 30, 27, 8, 9, or 30. And if it's durability or you're worried about overuse, British can spell him for a drive or a couple carries, whatever. That's great. And all the more so they should have been leading on Omarion because what we said about Drake being off and the receivers being off quite a bit. Like, go with this bell cow, let him run down. And I don't want to hear anything about game script. Like, oh, well, they just threw it so much because of game scripting. Like, no. Carolina was never so far behind that they needed to throw to get back in the game. No, they were either ahead or right there the whole game. No. So I don't need any of that. It's a miss, a complete miss that Carolina did not ride the Omarion Hampton train to victory in Kenan Stadium on Saturday night. Well, while it all seems bleak and miserable, all hope is not lost. Carolina had some chances late, and they do have some chances left this season. There are still goals in front of them. What are they? I'll share it all with you in just a second, along with our what to watch for recap. Right after I tell you that this episode of Locked On Tar Heels is brought to you by Athletic Brewing. It's time for your game changer of the week, brought to you by Athletic Brewing. Much like Cedric Gray, what a game he had Saturday, Athletic Brewing has completely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good, full flavor, and well-crafted, just like a full-strength beer. Cedric Gray, career high 18 total tackles. This dude is always posting, always showing up, and always delivering, just like Athletic Brewing Company does. You can find their non-alcoholic brews at a store near you or buy online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Near beer, exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. I want to remind you also that coming up on Friday from 11 a.m. till noon Eastern on every Locked On College YouTube page is Locked On College Football Kickoff Live, getting you ready for this weekend of college football football action. Don't miss out on it. All right, there are some things ahead of the Tar Heels. Let me say one more thing about this game before we get to that, though. One of the other issues is that Virginia actually tried to let Carolina back in the game, and Carolina couldn't capitalize it like twice in like the last 5 minutes or so of the game. As I referenced earlier, Virginia fumbled out at the back of the end zone as they were going in for what would have been a dagger touchdown late. Carolina gets the ball at the 20. Following that, it's a touchback. I did this. They get back-to-back chunk plays to get down to the UVA 18 in just 2 plays. Then they have a loss of 2, and then 3 straight incompletions to turn the ball over on downs. Nothing doing. And what's sad is you could have kicked a field goal there and maybe had another one later. We'll get more to that. Then, so following that turnover on downs, UVA gets the ball back. They get a first down, but then they get a holding penalty that Carolina, I talked about the coaching poor decisions. This was actually a good one to decline the penalty so that it turns into second down instead of maintaining the down. Great decision there. Carolina, because of that holding penalty, is actually able to get the ball up back with more time on the clock. I think it was around, minute 10, 20, something like that left. And they get the ball to the Virginia 48 in a couple plays. For some reason, Drake Maye doesn't clock the ball, tries to hurry up to it, ends up having to run around wasting time, throws the ball out of bounds anyway. That's another frustrating decision there. And then the next play is the game-sealing interception, which was a phenomenal play, I should say, by Virginia to get that. And I guess we should also say Carolina should have never been in this position. They should have done everything they needed to earlier. But that said, that holding call on Kamari Morales that called back a J.J. Jones touchdown was questionable at best. That to me was a really bad call. Like the first play of the fourth quarter, Carolina should have had a touchdown there. Would have been 31-24 Heels. You don't know how things play out from there, but clearly much better position to win after that. Well, as I said, at this point, not everything you want is still in front of you. And by that, I mean the top 10 ranking is obviously gone. They're 17th. You got to imagine the hopes of college football playoff. That's gone. But here's the deal. Making the ACC championship game is still on the table. So here's what you got to do. You can't let this one loss turn into 2 losses. You might have heard this sports cliche before, but here's what it means. You had this one loss. You can't dwell on it, get down on yourself, be mentally unfit from an athletic standpoint. You've got to turn the page, short-term memory. For those of you Ted Lasso fans out there, you got to goldfish this thing and be ready to go down to Atlanta next Saturday and get back on the winning side. And then you get Campbell after that, which should be a walkaway win. So you got to get these 2 wins, got to turn the page. So don't let one loss turn into 2. And here's the other thing with this. If I told you preseason that Carolina would be 6-1 after 7 games, I think we would have all taken that, right? Yes, absolutely. But the problem is when you drill down on the context and you realize that that one loss was not, say, Miami, it was Virginia. Then it's like a whole different ballgame. That hurts. But thankfully, as we look ahead to thinking about ACC Championship game potentials, Miami beat Clemson on Saturday night. Carolina holds the tiebreaker against Miami. So essentially, Carolina has a 2-game lead over both the Hurricanes and the Tigers now. So even if you take care of business everywhere else, but you still lose at Clemson, you're okay. But 3 other teams, including the Tar Heels, have just 1 conference loss. Florida State's undefeated. Louisville, Duke, and Virginia Tech are those 3 teams. Obviously, Carolina plays Duke, so they control that destiny. Louisville and Virginia Tech still have to play each other, so at least one of them is going to have another loss. But the question is, of the team, whichever team wins the Louisville-Virginia Tech game, would they lose another game? And even still, Carolina has to take care of business. They've got to beat Georgia Tech on the road. They've got to beat Duke at home. And I'm telling y'all right now, that Duke team is for real. Then they got to go the next week to Clemson and then the next week to NC State. That is a gauntlet where I already was like, you got to go 2-1 in those games to feel good about your hopes. But now, because of losing to Virginia, you have to run the table the rest of the way in the ACC to have any hope of making that ACC championship game. That is a tall task. Not saying they can't do it. This is going to be very, very difficult. So here's what the Tar Heels have to do in terms of not letting one loss turn into 2. You have to regroup. You have to circle the wagons. This is us. This is about us, not outside influences. I don't care about winning the Heisman. I don't care, all of that kind of stuff. You got to ignore critics in the same way that when everyone's praising you, you got to ignore them. You got to do what you got to do. You got to recognize what's still in front of you, how great that could be. And then you just get back to it this week. And ultimately for me, you apply the Dean Smith principle to this thing. You recognize what happened Saturday at Virginia. You admit it and you learn from it. And then you forget it and you move on to what's coming ahead on Saturday and the rest of the season. But again, it's still 1 game at a time. You can't look past Georgia Tech to that 3-game ACC closing stretch. It is what it is right now. All right, we still have to get to our what to watch for, recap, our shady stat of the game, our 3 stars of the game. We're going to hit on all of those things in just a second. Right after I tell you that this episode of Locked On Tar Heels is brought to you by Prize Picks, which offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday. Each Tuesday, Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide you even more value in your selections. Also, with the Prize Picks reboot policy, your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. I love that. It's so awesome because Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform that has that injury insurance. And I love it because Prize Picks is a super easy platform to utilize. You pick 2 or more players across any sport, any game, and all you have to do is look at the projected stat given and choose whether you think they will get more or less than that stat. So, for example, for Tuesday, as we get into that's the first NBA games of the season, I was looking ahead. Austin Reeves has 15.5 points. I'm taking the over on that, or the more on that. That just makes so much sense to me. Go check it out. All sorts of sports, all sorts of opportunities. You don't want to miss it. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege. And use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, let me quickly recap our what to watch for because our 4 things from Friday's what to watch for, I think, loomed large in this loss and helped tell some of the story of why Carolina lost. The first thing we looked at in terms of what to watch for was Carolina needed to continue their 3rd down success. The Tar Heels came in at 52.7%, converting 48 of their 91 third downs so far this season, 8th in the country. Unfortunately, in this game, they just go 4 for 13 on third downs, 30.8% success rate, which puts them down to 50% on the season. They're still 13th in the nation, which is incredible. But the problem is, and Michael Coe and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, Carolina was having all this success on third down, but struggling a bit on first and second down. And when you become so reliant on third down, if you have a game like this one where you're not finding as much success, it's going to bite you. The other thing is that Carolina was 0 for 2 on fourth downs. We talked about one of them earlier. The other was the throw to Tez Walker, where there could have been some DPI called on that next to last Carolina drive. And on the other hand, Virginia was 2 for 3 on fourth down. So there's that. The second thing in our what to watch for that we're recapping is I talked about Carolina looking to get interceptions. They already had 9 coming into this game, which matched their total for last season. And Virginia had been throwing some. Well, Carolina did get one. Armani Chapman got one right at the goal line. This was another moment where Virginia was threatening to score, and Chapman made a great play, had great position, turned, and just ball. There it is right there. And so Carolina now has 10 picks on the season, just 7 games in. And obviously, given what I said a second ago, that means they've already eclipsed their number of interceptions from last year in half as many games. That's pretty crazy stuff. The third thing we were watching for was Carolina getting a bunch of sacks against Virginia. Virginia had allowed at least 2 sacks in every game this season. And so you're looking like, hey, let's get 4, 5, 6 sacks against these guys. So Kamen Rucker had one in the first half on intentional grounding. In college, the player that essentially causes the intentional grounding gets credit for a sack. And then Bo Atkinson had one early in the second quarter. And so that's great to get 2 sacks. But I have 2 issues with how things played out. As I just said, 2 sacks was the baseline for this team. Virginia was allowing everybody 2 sacks. So getting 2 sacks is almost like getting no sacks against Virginia. So Carolina had to get to that baseline, but then get above it. And they did not. The other thing is that both of those sacks, as you just heard me say, were within the first half. And even the second one was early in the second quarter. So for the rest of the majority of the second quarter and the entire second half, Carolina did not record a single sack. That's not going to cut it against a team that has been allowing sacks like at will to the other teams. And then the fourth what to watch for thing we were looking at is third quarter scoring. North Carolina came in outscoring their opponents in the third quarter 71-24. Virginia, on the other hand, was being outscored by their opponents. And so you're expecting, hey, Carolina's only up at 3 at halftime, but man, they're going to come out in the third quarter and blitz Virginia. And things looked good out of the gate. Carolina got a stop, went down and scored, and you're like, yeah, that's what's up. But then Virginia ended up actually outscoring Carolina in the third quarter, 10-7 and 17-10 in the second half. It's not good enough. It's not going to do the job. And so all of these, while we're talking stats, all of these other things are over. That streak of scoring 30 or more points in every game this season, gone. They had a chance to set a program record with a 7th straight game to start the season. Didn't do it. 27 points. The shady stat I gave you to watch for, Carolina allowing 0 points at home in the first quarter this season, gone. Virginia scored 14 in the first quarter on North Carolina. And that streak of 11 straight wins for Carolina when they record 400 or more total yards of offense, gone. So all of that tough to look at. Now, at the end of the day, in the same way that I said there's silver linings because these goals are still ahead of you that you're looking for, in the same way, there were some great individual performances in this game. So let's point them out. Number 1 was the linebackers. And I'm talking both Cedric Gray and Powell. Echols, the other guys too, but specifically them. Ced records a career high. You ready for this number? 18 total tackles, 11 of which were solo. Unbelievable. And he is now 11 tackles from moving into 10th place in Carolina history in tackles. Great stuff. Power himself had 12 tackles, 7 of which for solo, meaning that the main linebacking duo combined for 30 tackles, 18 of which were solo. Unbelievable stuff. Our next star of the game, Noah Burnette, the kicker, had lost his job. There were injuries, came back. And this season, Noah Burnette is perfect on both field goals and PATs. 11 of 11 on field goals with a season long of 48 and 21 of 21 on points after. Love it. Carolina has to have that. Obviously, some other parts of the kicking game were not great Saturday, but Noah Burnette has been tried and true this year. Keep it up, brother. That's incredible. And then the other star of the game, Tez Walker. We'll stop making him a star of the game when he stops being a star of the game. 11 receptions for 146 yards and a touchdown. So now that he's played in 3 games, but only 2 of which in which he had a full week of preparation. Listen to this. In those 2 games with a full week of preparation, he's averaging 8.5 receptions a game, 139 yards a game, and 2 touchdowns a game. So extrapolate that out to if he had played all 7 games, he would have, obviously it's loosey-goosey math, but 59.5 receptions. The nation's lead is 66. He would have 973 receiving yards. The nation's most is 981, but the nation's most for 7 games is 826. So he would have eclipsed that, again, if the loosey-goosey numbers held out by about 150 receiving yards. And you would have, now touchdowns are super inconsistent, but 14 touchdowns extrapolated out over the season. That's ridiculous stuff there. And his 139 yards average per game, by the way, would be number 1 in the nation. Crazy stuff. Wish he had been playing the whole year, but excited to see how he and Drake continue to connect, and you got to move forward with that. All right. Shady stat of the game. Forgive me today, I forgot my sunglasses for those of you watching, so I'll just do the pretend goggles right there. It's our guy, Kamen Rucker, who recorded his seventh sack of the season, meaning 7 sacks in 7 games. That means 1 per game. He's on pace to have 13 sacks this season, assuming he plays in any postseason games that Carolina has, which I don't see why he wouldn't. Why do I bring that up? Here's the reason. There are only 2 Tar Heels in Carolina history who have recorded 13 sacks in a season. And just 2 guys you may or may not have heard of before, whose names are Lawrence Taylor and Julius Peppers. That's right. Kamen Rucker could become just the 3rd ever Tar Heel to record 13 sacks in a season, joining Lawrence Taylor and Julius Peppers. That's the territory he's in. Appreciate him while he's here. The Butcher keeps carving it up. All right, weekend wrap up real quick from other sports, and then we'll get out of here. Women's soccer won on Sunday 6-1 against Syracuse. Great stuff there. Men's soccer hasn't ended yet, just started recently as I'm recording this. But they played Louisville at home on Sunday. Hopefully they will not tie. We'll see what happens. Field hockey, interestingly, lost at Virginia on Friday 2-3. Virginia's a great team. You just hate losing to Virginia in 2 different sports over the weekend. That's tough. Volleyball split over the weekend, winning at Clemson on Friday 3-2, and then losing at Georgia Tech on Sunday 1-3. Folks, it's great to be back together after kind of a rough weekend. But again, group therapy, it's good for the soul. We're getting there. Again, tomorrow we'll unpack what we know, at least about the secret scrimmage against Florida Atlantic over the weekend. Great reports from it, but interested to talk more about it. I want to remind you, you can join our Discord and great conversations with the whole Locked On Tar Heels community. The link to that is in the show notes on both video and audio. Don't forget to follow the show on Twitter, Locked On Heels. You can follow me at Isaac Shade. Email us, lockedontarheels@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe, smash the like button, and leave comments on your thoughts on the game. Hey, even off a bad weekend, it's always a great day to be a Tar Heel. We'll be right back with you tomorrow. But until then, peace.